Welcome to Chicago Jewish Cafe. For interview, today's interview, I'm going to start with a citation from the preface of the eighth issue of the HA, the Journal of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College. Two paragraphs there. When Hannah Arendt sat down to write The Origins of Totalitarianism, after spending over 10 years in exile, she began with a history of anti-Semitism. In order to understand the horrific emergence of totalitarianism, she had to confront the question of why the Jewish people had been targeted. She found the common sense explanation. The Jews were scapegoats to be wrong. The scapegoat explanation, she writes, was one of the principal attempts to escape the seriousness of anti-Semitism and the significance of the fact that the Jews were driven into the storm of the center of events. For Arendt, anti-Semitism chose the Jews as the key to the world's ills for very specific reasons, and those reasons needed to be understood and confronted. Arendt argued that political anti-Semitism is more than Jew hatred. Rather, it is a pseudo-scientific ideology seeking to prove that Jews are responsible for all the evils in the world. In its social form, anti-Semitism unleashed the fantasy of the Jew in general as a foreigner. The social fantasy of the Jew forced upon Jews a terrible choice between being a parvenu who rejects their Jewishness and assimilates, or pariah, defined by their Jewishness. In its political form, anti-Semitism is a form of racial ideology that justifies oppression and even annihilation of Jews as foreigners who are the key to the problems of the world. I have a lot of questions regarding this citation, and to help me with answering them, we invited Professor of Politics, Philosophy, and Human Rights at Bard College, and founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities at Bard College, Roger Berkowitz. Roger, welcome.
It's a privilege to be here, Alexander. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you for stopping by and taking your valuable time to talk to us about it. So, as I written to you before, my main interest is Hannah Arendt's differentiation between the anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. What is the difference?
Thank you, and I really appreciate this question because I think it's deeply important both to understand anti-Semitism in the 1920s and 30s, but also to understand it today. And also, if we want to think seriously about all sorts of racisms today. But in brief, Hannah Arendt thinks that there's been Jew hatred for a long time, and she calls it religious Jew hatred. It's the kind of Jew hatred that Christians or other groups have when they don't, there's a group of Jews living in their midst and they want to take their land, or they don't like the fact that they are different and they discriminate against them, or they every once in a while commit a pogrom or something like that. And she thinks this kind of Jew hatred has been going on for 2,000 years, and it's bad. She doesn't like it. She's Jewish, and she thinks it's dangerous, but she doesn't think it's super dangerous. And she doesn't think it is what suddenly in the mid 20th century turned into totalitarianism and the kind of genocidal anti-Semitism of the Holocaust. So the difference she makes is she says that she writes them in different ways. So Jew hatred she writes as anti-capital S Semitism. It's a hatred of Semites or Jews in this case. Anti-Semitism she writes as one word, all lowercase. And what she says is that that's a secular 19th century ideology. What that means is that it has nothing to do with Jews as their religion. Anti-Semitism that leads to kind of the totalitarianism or the Holocaust didn't hate Jews because of their religion. They don't hate them because they worship God or don't worship Christ. That's not what was issue, right? When the Nazis killed Jews, it wasn't because they had theological differences with them. They also didn't hate them, you know, you know, because they were down the street and doing something different. In fact, one of the things that we see over and over again is that some of the most virulent anti-Semitic movements are in places where there's almost no Jews. Um, so Arendt says, you have to take seriously what's going on here. And what she says is that um, all all totalitarian movements um are movements, and she begins with that, and as movements they need to move, and they need to they're motivated by a mood, she says, and the mood is often one of destruction. There's a feeling that the world is unjust, that the government is corrupt, the system is corrupt, and they're almost always driven by what she calls a hatred of the state, and they want to break the state open. I mean, you see this around the world today in Europe and in the United States with movements around the world wanting to, in a sense, crack the state open. And what she says is these movements, need propaganda. They need to motivate not just their true believers, but people beyond them. And and in that sense, they pull in ideologies. And there are two ideologies which Arendt says, I mean, there are many ideologies out there, right? There's environmentalism as an ideology, and feminism as an ideology. But she says there are two ideologies that over the last 150 years or so have been incredibly successful at motivating mass movements. One is Bolshevism, namely the ideology that the bourgeoisie control the state and are responsible for all the evils of the world and need to be eliminated. And the other is racism or anti-Semitism, the idea that a particular group of people, whether it's the Jews or blacks or others, have a certain kind of power and control the state and need to be eliminated. And so what she says is that anti-Semitism is much more this kind of thing. It's an ideology that people who are trying to lead and motivate mass movements, that want to motivate the mob and intellectuals together, who are trying to destroy the state for political reasons, pick a group that they can motivate people to and associate with the state. And here's where it comes down to where she disagrees with the scapegoat theory, right? She says she tells that funny joke that was first told in a play in Theresienstadt, where they're saying we have to kill all the Jews, and we have to kill all the bicyclists, and they're going on about how they have to kill all the bicyclists and kill all the bicyclists. And someone says, I don't get it. Why do we have to kill the bicyclists? And someone else says, well, why the Jews? And what she's trying to say here is, of course, that that the scapegoat reason, right, suggests that there's no particular reason that the Jews or the bicyclists, anyone could be there. But for her, there's a reason the Nazis picked the Jews. It's because that in the 17th and 18th centuries and into the middle of the 19th century, the Jews were associated with the state. They were bankers to the state for a certain period of time. And even after that had ended, certainly in the mid 19th century, they got certain privileges from the state in a European intellectual world in which um, the idea of equality and rising democratic equality was the norm. The Jews needed exceptions. They needed to be able to um, not work on Saturdays instead of Sundays. They needed to be able to follow kosher laws and other things. And this, in a sense, special treatment, which is how it was presented, associated the Jews with the state and with the princes and with the kings and their tradition of being bankers for the state as well. And so they were able to be seen as the people who are connected to the state and, in some sense, are responsible for all the evils and corruptions of the state. And that's how she distinguishes what she calls anti-Semitism as an ideology versus anti-Semitism as Jew hatred.
Hmm. So, are you saying that a person can have a hatred of Jewish people without hating Jews as individuals? That's what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that there are many people who don't like Jews, right? Go to a
They do not like Jews as individuals,
yeah. I mean,
or they just don't like Jews as the people.
so go to a goyish country club or something and walk in with a kippah, and people will be like, oh, I don't want to hang out with you, right? They don't like Jews. But people who don't like Jews don't usually say, I want to wipe out the Jewish race. They just say, you go to your place and I'll go to my place, right? You go hang out in the Catskills and at your Jewish country clubs and let me hang out in, the Hamptons and my Jewish country club and my non-Jewish country club. Um, and so, what she's trying to say is, look, there's been hatred of Jews forever, but that doesn't lead to genocide. Something new had to emerge, right? It can lead to a pogrom here or a pogrom there, but that's not genocide. That's not the belief that in order that we need to wipe out the entirety of the Jewish race in order for in order for the world to survive and thrive.
Hmm.
And she's saying something new had to emerge, and she makes this interesting comparison between the ideological genocide of the Jews by the Nazis and the ideological genocide of the bourgeoisie by the Bolshevists. And
Hopefully one day we're going to talk about Hannah Arendt specifically as a person and as an individual, as a political activist, and as a writer, but not this time. I mean,
okay,
but before I'm going to ask my question, I came across somewhere, I don't remember where, that Hannah Arendt, when she came to the United States in 1941, said that anti-Semitism in the United States was so dense that it was worse than in Germany, in Nazi Germany. Am I recalling something that you do not know about?
um, I don't know that quote, which it doesn't mean she couldn't have said it. It probably, if it is something she wrote, it was probably in a letter. Um,
It was written, and I was I could not find it
mm,
in preparation for our conversation. But at that time, I was thinking, why would she say something like this? And then I thought, she left Germany in 1933, right? 1934. And at that time, I guess from Weimar Republic to Nazi Germany, the intensity of everyday anti Semitism or anti Jewish feelings was not fully developed. Maybe it was, I do not know. Maybe that's why she was comparing. But in the United States in 1941, after 30s, when 1930s, where there was a horrific rise of anti-Semitism in the United States, maybe that's why she had that feeling. I do not know, or maybe she had a feeling, just meeting some people because her English was not that good yet at that time. I do not know, but in any case,
yeah.
So,
Well,
so
I don't know either. I mean, she makes a distinction, Alexander, between, you mentioned it in your opening remarks, between political anti-Semitism and social anti-Semitism, right? Um, Social anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism that leads to discrimination of Jews in society, and it's based on this idea of the Jew that needs to be avoided, or that you don't want to be in contact with. And she thinks that's uncomfortable, but not politically dangerous. Um, Political anti-Semitism is the anti-Semitism that says that Jews should be deprived of the right to vote, or the right to work, or the right to serve in the civil service, or the right to serve in offices, and that, she thinks, um, is profoundly dangerous. Um, I don't think she thought there was political anti-Semitism in the United States, but she certainly did believe and wrote about um, intense social anti-Semitism in the United States.
mhm.
But that she ever said that it was worse than in Germany, I don't remember. I don't. I'm not saying it's not possible. I just don't know it. I don't know that quote.
um, given the today's rise of anti-Semitism as a worldview, especially in Muslim countries, I mean, and when I say rise of anti-Semitism in Muslim countries, I mean going to even Turkey, which was until recently seems like moderate country. We're seeing, the desire to see Israel annihilated as a Jewish state. And it
Hmm.
comes not only from Iran, but as I said, from Turkey and from Palestinians, all Palestinians, majority of Palestinians, regardless. There's some statements that coming out from them that are truly, truly genocidal. And when I say genocidal, I do not mean just 45,000 dead, in Gaza. I mean the intent to exterminate people as people. And
Hmm.
of course, in Israel, the Jews do not have that intent to exterminate Arabs as Arabs. There's 2 million Arabs in Israel, living as more or less equal to Jews, people in that society. But in the Palestinian society, there's intense desire to exterminate Jews as Jews and Israel as a Jewish state, to wipe it out. I mean, but my question is this: uh, if today there would be a Hannah Arendt alive, given her view of these things, what would be her assessment of the current situation?
Okay. So first of all, I run the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. As you said, I make it very clear I don't speak for Hannah Arendt. I have no idea. One of the things I love about Hannah Arendt, and I mean this with utter sincerity, is that there's very no one else that I've ever encountered who is less predictable in certain ways than she is. She she she's not a systematic theorist. She's a thinker who encounters the world and accepts the fact that she has her opinions and her prejudices and her ideas, and thinks it through in an original way each time. And I love that about her. So, um, all I can say is that if she were alive today, she would surprise us. I'm convinced of that. Um, I can tell you how I see the world, informed by a very intense and I hope meaningful uh, study of her work and her thoughts.
Please
Um,
do.
but that's as good as I can get. I think she would see it, or I see it this way, informed by her, which is that um, for many years, uh, um, the main ideology of of the left in the world, and certainly in the United States, but around the world, was Marxism. Um, and under Marxism, uh, the proletariat was seen as the good, and that we wanted to bring about the victory of the proletariat over the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie was evil, and the political demand was that if we could create a proletarian communist society, we would end up in some sort of better or utopia, right? Um, I think somewhere in the 1980s to 2000s, the left lost faith in the Marxist story, um, for a whole host of reasons, and they ceased to identify really with the proletariat, and as a result, political action became very difficult to sustain, and the left moved away from politics. What it moved towards was a moralization of politics, and it replaced its love for the proletariat, which was a political idea that the proletariat actually had interest, right? They needed money, they needed housing, they needed power, um, with a moral idea that there were victims and there were oppressors. The victors are the indigenous people, and the oppressors are, the people with power. Now, there's always going to be victims and there's always going to be oppressors. And so this is not really a political idea. You're never going to get rid of victors and oppressors. It becomes a moral idea. And it simply says there are good people and bad people. And the ideology that has emerged on the left, we can call it by different names. We can call it indigeneity. We can call it post-colonialism, whatever you want to call it, or wokeism. But the basic idea is that there's a hierarchy of oppressions in the world, and the lowest are the most innocent, and the highest are the most guilty. Um, and I think you can see this all over the world, whether it's in racial relations here in the United States, or in anti-imperialist movements, etc. What's what's I think profoundly um, upsetting and concerning, as it concerns the Jews and anti-Semitism, is that amidst all the different oppressed peoples in the world, um, whether it's the Uyghurs in China, or people in Sudan, or slaves, and in throughout, I mean, still slavery in much of Africa, and all sorts of incredibly tyrannical and awful regimes. Um, the truest, most innocent, and refugees all over the world. The one group of refugees that is the most innocent and most oppressed are the Palestinians, and the one oppressor. I mean, whether it's China is an oppressor, or the United States can be an oppressor, or Syria, or North Korea, or Cuba, but the one true great oppressor in the world that everyone has to rally against is Israel. There's the Jews, or Israel. Um, and so you've created this situation in which the Jews, who, I mean, we can look at the numbers to some degree, but 40% of them came from displaced persons camps because no one else would take them after the war. Another 40% of them came from after they were expelled from other countries in the Middle East, whether it's Lebanon, or Syria, or Jordan. And uh, it's hard to call these people colonizers. Now, I will say this: from the Palestinian perspective, they were colonized, and I think that's a fair statement. I think one of the tragedies of the Middle East is that you have two people who've suffered enormous injustices, and the Jews needed a homeland, and I think the Jewish Zionist movement, which had many different strands to it. Some were labor Zionists, some had sought a homeland, some simply wanted to live in Israel without a state. But the Jabotinsky wing of the Zionist movement won out, and um, decided and wanted Zionism to lead to a state. The problem was that there were Palestinians in that state, and I think there's no doubt that
I'm sorry, there were Arabs
there were
living in
Arabs
the
in that state.
territory that
Yeah.
was called at one time Palestine.
Well, okay. So we can talk about that, right? I mean, there were Arabs in that state, and by 1948, many of those Arabs had come to see themselves as Palestinians, right? Um,
Well, no, 1964.
well, no, I mean, I think they had already started to identify. I mean, there was already an identitarian movement. They hadn't yet. Um, in any case, the point is,
The first time, yes. I Okay. So continue, please. I'm
yeah,
sorry. Yeah.
yeah, no, I mean, look, all I'm saying is, I think that there's no doubt in my mind that the Jews are not your typical colonizers and oppressors. And I think to call them the worst oppressors and the worst colonizers in the world is simply
How
you
about
know,
returnees to their original homeland?
yeah, I'm again, I there are all sorts of ways one can tell this story. Um,
And the
you
way
know,
I see it, the colonizer are offsprings of the Arabs that occupied it at the beginning of 7th century.
okay. Well, some Jews came back for religious reasons, some Jews came back for political reasons, and some Jews came for economic reasons, and some Jews came because they had nowhere else to go. They didn't really care about the ancient homeland of Judea and Samaria. I mean, they just came because it was where they had nowhere else to go. Um, I I think that both peoples have legitimate, just claims to the land. I think both peoples have committed incredible um, acts of horror on the other. Uh, I think it's a tragic and sad situation. I think that's how Arendt would see it, right? Arendt um, was very much involved in the Zionist movement, but she never wanted she but she moved around a lot. And by 1944, in a very famous essay called Zionism Reconsidered, basically said Zionism, um, the good part of Zionism in her mind, which was that Jews needed a homeland, had lost out to, in her mind, the racist and colonizing bad form of Zionism, which is that the Jews needed a state, which was a Jewish state. And part of her analysis of totalitarianism during the war is that nation states that are both states and nations will always have first and second class citizens in them. And once you have second class citizens in them, those citizens will demand their own state, whether they're Slovaks in Czechoslovakia, or whether they're Germans in Poland, or whether they're Jews in any of these places, or whether they're Poles in Romania or Romanians in Poles. And what she says is there are really only three solutions to the minority problem within a nation state system. You can expel them, they can assimilate, or you can liquidate them. And she is clear headed in her critique of the nation state and her belief that the nation state, as a system in which we organize foreign affairs, cannot deal with the minority question in a just way. And in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she is, I mean, in a way that she says, um, the really only solutions were assimilation, expulsion, or liquidation. And she says that in a way, the Nazis had a more eloquent solution to it than the world community, which tried to hide what they were doing behind stupid laws. The Nazis said, "Here's what we're going to do." Now she was being ironic, but she really did think that nation states were inherently unable to deal with the minority situation, and she didn't want Israel to become a nation state with a large minority of Arabs.
What did she want Israel to be?
So, I mean, again, we can call her a dreamer or whatever. She was allied with Judah Magnus and others who believed in what she called a homeland or a federal system. She thought there should be federations of Jews, Arabs, Druze, Christians, and that they would all have their own homeland where they would have rights, but it would be a federation, and it would be a weak central federation that allowed for different homelands. There are many people today who still, there's this, I don't know if you know the movement, a land for all. Um, but this is a movement of both Jews and Palestinians in the current situation who are trying to go back to this idea. I'm not saying it was realistic. I'm not saying it could have happened or not. All I'm saying is she was aware and believed that if you made Israel into a Jewish state, it would become a racist state that would treat Palestinians as second class citizens and that there would be no solution to that problem. And unfortunately, I think she was right. Um, that doesn't mean I have another solution. I don't think she had a full other solution. Um, in the end, she believed it was important enough for the Jews to have a state that she supported the state of Israel. She supported the war of 1967. She supported the war of 1973. She was a Jewish patriot, an Israeli patriot in the end. But she was also a critic who believed that, unfortunately, as a nation state and as a Jewish state, Israel would be caught up in an impossible situation. And I think she's been proven right on that.
Well, she's not the only person that could have predicted that Jewish state or Jews, any Jewish community or Jews as individuals are always in some kind of a difficult situation from which there's no easy way out. I mean, uh, before we finish this, I appreciate your differentiation between anti-Semitism and Jew hatred. Um, uh, but I want to ask about this thing. Her, you know, totalitarian, the idea of totalitarian state. It seems like she meant, uh, first of all, Nazi Germany.
Well, she says that in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she's writing about two totalitarian movements. One is the Nazi movement, and the other is the Bolshevist movement. She thinks those are, and she makes comparisons and thinks they're very similar.
Hmm. It, and I'm glad to hear that, that she also meant the Soviet Union or the byproduct of the Bolshevik revolution, the Soviet Union. And the reason for me it's interesting because with regard to anti-Semitism, Soviet Union showed itself to be uh, on the front line. I mean, and I mentioned 1964, it was creation of PLO with the help of Soviet Union. At that time, it was socialist ideology that PLO had, and Soviet Union went hog wild on supporting the Palestinians because that became the central element of the Soviet ideology because Marxism as such no longer carried any water in
Yeah.
the 1960s. But anti-Semitism became the central element of the Soviet ideology. And today it is the center element of the leftist ideology in the United States and Western Europe.
So, I mean, I think that a lot of what you say is right. We also have to remember that it was the Soviet Union more than any other great power that supported the actual um, declaration of the state of Israel. The United States was not
But
so
I'm sorry, just for 8 or 9 months.
well, but
And the reasons for it, and the reasons, by the way, for it also had to do with some things that were out of control. I mean,
you're right. You know, she sees the Soviet Union. I mean, certainly there was anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union. She's aware of that. She writes about it. Um, she sees the central ideological enemy of Bolshevism to be the bourgeoisie. Now, obviously, there's a connection between Jews and bourgeoisie in certain ideological propagandistic circles.
in the Soviet Union, the United States was highly respected and loved by majority of people in the Soviet Union. But the Zionism, was the central point of its ideology of hatred.
Okay. I don't think she would have agreed with that, but, and, but, I don't know it as well as you do, and I can't. I'm not gonna. I just don't know enough to say yes or no. I mean, my understanding is the center claim of at least socialism or Bolshevism was anti-bourgeois.
100 years ago.
Yeah, okay. I mean, again,
But by 1929, anti-Semitism became the central element of the Soviet ideology. There were
okay.
two elements because the Soviet Union was resisting anti-Semitism until the Second World War, but it resisted only for one reason and one reason only.
But Alexander, I mean, in Ukraine, right, where 6 million kulaks and peasants were killed, it wasn't anti-Semitism; it was anti-bourgeoisism. I mean,
It was not anti-bourgeoism. It was nothing. It was they desired their members of 1919 in civil war, and when they started 1929 collectivization, the Ukrainians started resisting again. They were shooting. There were all kinds of things, and in order to suppress the Ukrainian resistance, the Stalin adopted the policy of repression and
mhm.
came total repression and extraction of all the agricultural products, leaving people with nothing to eat.
Yeah, okay.
But nothing was fight against bourgeoisie.
It
It had
wasn't a, it wasn't a, it wasn't an attempt to collectivize against private ownership and things of that sort.
Yes, but the reaction, in Ukraine was, and the fear of Ukrainian resistance was connected with the civil war, was the experience of civil war.
Okay. All right. So look, I don't know enough about the Russian world that you do. And I don't want
But
to.
I saw in your biography, by the way, that in 1990 you were traveling that way and you met all kinds of people there, and it became
I did
very
live in
interesting.
Russia a fair bit. I was as a sort of expat. Between 1988 and 1991, I was there, not continually, but on and off, probably a total of about 8 or 9 months. Um, and lived in Moscow and sometimes in Petersburg. So yeah, I spent some time there, and I certainly was influenced greatly by my time there in many ways. But I would not consider myself a Sovietologist or an expert in that area of the
I
world.
understand. I understand.
Um, but
But this issue, of anti-Semitism as the worldview, as an ideology, to me, is one of the big things that Hannah Arendt said, because
yeah,
many people confuse, Jew hatred with anti-Semitism. Jew hatred, is just personal relationships between people and dislike or like whatever of Jews. But anti-Semitism is a much broader thing, and this is
I
what.
agree. And I think what's the hard part we're having right now, and as we get all these definitional questions about what is anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism and things like that, is that most people on the left don't dislike Jews. In fact, many of the most anti-Israel people on the left are Jews. Um, you
Roger,
know,
I want to say that this is just a temporary moment in the development of what is taking place.
it may
I
be.
mean, they do not dislike Jews because of the way it was before, but that will change in 5 years.
Well, it may, and if it does, we're in trouble. And I
Uh,
think you're absolutely right to be pointing it out as a serious possibility. All I'm saying is that very much like the ideologies that Arendt describes, post-colonial ideology. I think the people currently who are um, arguing against Israel are less concerned with Jews than they are with the general post-colonial ideology. And what they've found, which is what the pan-Germanists found in the late 19th century and what the Nazis found in the early 20th century, is that if you want to promote your ideology, you need to popularize it with um with popular racisms. And the one that has the historical ability and current ability to appeal to the widest number of people is one that blames the Jews. And I think that's what's going on. I think the Jews are picked um, because they are seen as connected to uh, a system, the system of international world order, etc. I don't think there's any actual reason for that.
But
I think they're not.
it's not only world order. I see that some of the biggest thinkers
Yeah,
in ecological movement blame Israel as the source for climate change.
yeah. No, and I think that's ridiculous. But I think that it's fits the pattern, right? Because Jews are, the old protocols of the elders of Zion, and because the idea that Jews control banking or control the media or, whatever it is, um, suddenly we say, the Jews are the source of power in the world, and they're the core, and it's ridiculous. We know this, you know this. But and I think even the people making this argument, if you actually had to ask them about it, they would say, of course not. But that's the argument that's being made implicitly, right? That somehow, of all the different post-colonial struggles in the world, the one that matters most is the one between Israel and Palestine, because the Jews are the true oppressors and the Palestinians are the true oppressed. And that's an extraordinarily dangerous development that did start in 1967 with the Arafat speech at the UN and the implicit embrace or amalgamation of the Algerian movement with the Palestinian movement. And I see that ideology, that post-colonial ideology, which Fanon brought to Algeria and then was brought to Arafat and into the Palestinian cause, as having become more powerful because of its connection to anti-Semitism in the modern idea, and that's an extremely dangerous situation that we're in today.
Uh, my idea of sources of anti-Semitism is somewhat different. Uh, Toward the end of our conversation, I just want to say that I agree with all anti-Semites in the world. The Jews are the center of the world,
Wow.
and we are. Just one second, let me finish. And we are the greatest dissident in human history. We were against everybody all the time, against all pagans, against all kinds of other people, against death, against dying for the sake of Baal or Allah or whatever it is. We are the problem.
Okay.
And I hope that will continue to be the problem for all the evildoers in this world.
Well, that I hope we are too.
Yeah, but I support. Actually, I have similar attitude toward Hannah Arendt. I do not have critical attitude toward her. Like some people. I believe that it was difficult situation for a very interesting person who had mind of her own and kept on going forward.
I agree. I'm going to have to run, Alexander. I apologize, but it's been a pleasure talking to you. And if you ever want to talk again, I'd be happy to.
Roger, I'm going to keep you to your word because I have many things to talk about to you with regard to Hannah Arendt. Anyway,
Wonderful. We'll
thank
do
you
it
once
again.
again for stopping by, and I hope to see you again.
Thanks very much, Alexander. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.